Have you ever bid on a project where you thought, man, I really nailed the schedule here? And then you get going and you understand that you made a lot of mistakes that have a massive impact on your profitability. I know it happens in construction. Doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it does mean that you need to do a much better job in the estimating phase up front, analyzing the schedule and the risks associated with that schedule. And that is the topic of conversation here today on Construction Genius with my guest, Melvin Newman. Melvin is the CTO and president of PataBid. And prior to founding PataBid in 2018, he worked in the construction industry for 15 plus years as an estimator and a PM, which means that Melvin knows what he's talking about. He's not just a tech head who thought, maybe I can make some money making software for construction people. He's a second-time guest on Construction Genius, and you know that I don't bring on lousy guests. And so if you're on for the second time, it means you've got something to say and you've got some value to provide. And if you're concerned with the risks associated with scheduling, this podcast episode is for you. Let's dive right in. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Melvin, welcome back to Construction Genius.
Pleasure to be here.
Many years ago, I was chatting with one of my clients. It was actually I was doing a leadership development course for them, a 12-month program, and it was in-house. And we got onto the topic of schedule. And one of the owners of the company, he was really passionate about this. He said, "We run the job. We run the job." And they're a contractor that kind of sits in the middle of the construction process. They're not at the beginning. They're not at the end. And he really meant that in terms of doing whatever he can to dial in the schedule and make sure that his guys are on the job site doing work and not standing around and things are flowing. So when it comes to the schedule, what are some of the biggest challenges that contractors have?
Straight up, I think some of it is contractors just miss the schedule altogether. They don't pay attention to it, especially at the beginning stages of the project. And I mean, right at the tendering stage, contractors tend to ignore it as kind of I'll deal with it, when the project's in operation. But once you get past, that $20,000 or $30,000 micro project, schedule drives everything these days. And misunderstanding what the critical path is on a schedule. And that can sometimes be very difficult to identify, especially on more complex projects. Misunderstanding what the current market is doing to your schedule, meaning everything from the time the owner wants the building to be up and operational to when you can get product in. All of this is just major risk items to the schedule. And contractors, when they're starting out a project, especially in the trades, general contractors tend to have this fairly dialed in these days, but the trades especially tend to just ignore it until it's too late.
Why do you think they ignore it?
It hasn't really been a major point of risk, I would say, up until about the last 10, 12 years, where owners have started to condense project timelines. And they write that into the tender documents right at the beginning of the project. They'll put little fine print into the contract, must be delivered on such and such a date. And if you miss that, one line item in the tender form, it's legally binding. You submit your price, and then you go back and suddenly start to look at this date and say, "Ooh, if I work back from that, March 14th date to today, I have to have all of my material delivered by next week," especially when you start to get into some of the more complex trades. Concrete and formwork, that's fairly straightforward in, quote unquote complexity. Formwork, I mean, if you're doing major unique architectural shapes, can be a little trickier to get a hold of the formwork, get that set in. But once you have it on site, you're going. And if you're doing a multi-story building, a lot of it is just, repetitive as you go up. But when you start talking about mechanical, electrical, plumbing, these kind of complex trades where you have hundreds of different material types on a project, and what we ran into a couple years ago during COVID, there was the slam dunk duopoly there, where we had COVID happening, and then we had one of the main resin factories in Texas, I think it was, went up in flames, and suddenly you could not get anything PVC to save your life. Whether that was conduit, whether that was pipe, whatever it was, you could not get PVC items. And that lasted for a good year and a half to 2 years before that started to roll out. And then it became microchip shortages. All of this is huge risk to the schedule. But I mean, it goes back to, I was on one project where thankfully we caught it at the time of tender. The excavation contractor just never read the front end documents. And their whole project was major excavation. And he calls me up with his price a couple days. Thankfully, it was a couple days before closing. And he's like, "Yeah, what do you think? How do you think I'm doing?" And I'm like, "Dude, your price is too low." And he's like, "Well, what do you know? You're not an excavator." I'm like, "Correct, but I know this project is taking place in January." Like in Canada in January, you're not going to be able to excavate anything here without major work because it's all frozen. So understanding those sort of things, or if it's taking place in the middle of summer in Arizona, your productivity is just going to be down. So that's kind of the core there. And if that's missed at the beginning, your project has huge risks on it that are going to be missed.
It's interesting. Something just popped into my head. I just want to throw it out to you here. Much anguish comes to a company when they don't understand the contract that they're getting into. They haven't thoroughly read the documents. And something popped into my head. I just want to bounce it off of you. I know you're in tech. Is what is the use, do you think, of a construction company getting comfortable as an initial sort of look, uploading one of these documents via a PDF to a chat GPT or some other AI and asking the chat, listen, give me the top 5 concerns regarding schedule based on this document?
That's a fantastic question. I would say with something like a chat GPT, don't use chat GPT.
Okay. Great.
Simply because you need something specifically trained. Like, this is why we have lawyers that are specifically trained in construction. A chat GPT is a massive averaging engine. It will spit back knowledge on everything it's trained on, but it's trained on too much for something like construction. A few years ago, you hit the nail on the head though, AI, being able to use that. A few years ago in my job as an estimator, I was running into this issue fairly consistently. The executives wanted to do a go no go discussion on a project, right? They want to do that go no go the day after the project comes out for bid. Well, these projects have, thousands of pages of documentation. How do you do a risk analysis on that kind of a project within a couple of days? And so I went and trained a natural language AI to look for common risks. Things like liquidated damages, the project schedule was a big one. And this was just straight up a tool off the side of my desk to just help my own job. And it was exactly what you said. You drag all the documents onto it, and then it would crawl through and just look for these kind of key risk items. And it was able to crawl through several thousand pages in about 30 seconds.
Okay, so let me just stop you real quick. Let me just stop you. Just stop you. So you trained a natural language AI, and I just want to make the point here that what you're describing here is very much possible to do, correct?
100%. Yep. 100%. And there are a couple of companies, I'm trying to remember, I met one of them at NICA 2 years ago. I'm pulling a blank. I can remember their booth, but they basically did something similar on an even grander scale. They would check the legalese in the front end. So there are companies that are actively working on this right now, and it's 100% possible. One of my favorite stories was we got a project in, and they wanted to do a go no go, and they assigned it to one of my colleagues to take a run through the documents, and he starts going through them, and he started at 8 a.m. in the morning, and at lunchtime he came to me and he said, "Here's what I found. Can you double check for me?" And I'm like, "Sure." So I just dragged the documents onto my little AI, got up, grabbed a cup of coffee, sat back down, and it had found everything that he had found, identical. Made copy and paste of all the risk items. And then he was incredibly pissed off at me because he spent 4 hours to do what the AI had done in 30 seconds.
Yeah. So this is
It's a tremendous application for this.
yes. Yeah. So there's a bunch of companies out there. I know a number of different ones. Ones like DigiBuild are using AI in the way that they're executing their solutions. And so I want to make a marker here for everyone. Don't just glaze your eyes over. This is you make a great point though, Melvin, that Chat GPT is such it's a generalist, not a specialist. And so you need to be considerate about building or accessing a specialized trained AI for the particular application in construction that you're looking to get information on.
100%. And this is where like I've seen a lot of people getting excited about Chat GPT. I mean, across the spectrum, but in construction, I'd argue that it's the wrong tool, because we're a highly specialized industry. But the idea of applied AI in construction is fantastic, especially for contractors like that framer you were discussing there. He's not going to have a lawyer on staff, most likely. He might have one on retainer, but he's not going to have one on staff. He's not going to have a contract specialist on staff. And if you're trying to make those rapid fire go no go decisions early on in a project, being able to use an AI there is absolutely critical. If it's a higher risk project that you want to target, bring the specialists in, absolutely. But using the AIs as those first passes on everything can dramatically reduce your workload, because it's going to pull out the big items for you easily. It might miss the nuances in the contract language where you want a proper specialist to look at that, but it's going to give you that idea way before you start anything. Okay, is this kind of that red, yellow, green project? Is it high risk? Is it? Yeah, exactly.
I love it because again, we want to make the point. This is not a cure-all necessarily, particularly at this point in the evolution of the technology, but it is something that if you use it correctly, it can save you a bunch of time.
100%. And I mean, I look at it as kind of like the transportation industry. Horses and buggies. They were used for millennia. And then we started to produce cars. And then Ford invented the moving assembly line and made cars for the masses. They became, the standard methodology. We still have horses everywhere. We can still do that. But we've evolved to commoditize transportation. AI is going to be the same sort of thing. It's not there to replace. I mean, I run into this all the time with our platform. We have AI built into the foundation of the PataBid platform. And I get on these calls with contractors, and they're like, "Oh, so I can go get rid of my estimating team?" And I'm like, "No, no, 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 no. You, you, you cannot do that. If anybody tells you you can, run." Because AI, even if I were to train an AI to be 100% awesome at, reading construction documents, it's not going to know your local conditions. Like, we do a bunch of stuff with fabrication shops, and they're like, "Okay, so you've taught this AI how to read fabrication drawings." Yep, perfect. It can pull everything off, but I'm like, you have to understand, it doesn't know the door sizes to your shop. If somebody gives you a spool sheet for a 48-inch diameter piece of pipe that's 100 feet long, the AI is not going to know if that's going to fit inside your shop. That is where your human knowledge is 100% there. The AI is just going to backstop you and do a bunch of the grunt work, right?
Excellent. Let's pivot back to what we were talking about in terms of schedule. The word that pops into my mind is discipline. And that's one of the things that some contractors have a challenge with simply because they're so busy. So describe for me a disciplined process that a contractor should go through when a tender or a bid first hits their radar.
Number one, get the front end documents. If you're in a trade, one of the famous things that GCs will do to you is not send you the front end documents, but they will still bind you to them in your subcontract. And you should never, ever sign off on that kind of a contract until you have read those front end documents. And that is, again, a core thing, especially in the various different sub-trades that's missed. They look at those as they don't apply to me, but I guarantee you every trade spec section binds you back to those front-end documents. And that's where I did an analysis once, and basically the first 100 pages of every construction project contains like 75% of the risk items.
That's really, really important, because I can just see someone, they get the bid in and they immediately click to their bit, right?
Yep.
And they miss that first 100 pages and therefore miss 75% of the risk. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. Those first 100 or so pages of documentation on a project are absolutely critical to read and understand every time. And even if you use AI to do the first pass, you have to go back and read those when you decide to actually pursue a project. And so step one, read through those. This was flogged into me by my mentors early on in my career, is understand those front pages. And then the number one thing to look for is schedule. Find out what your project schedule is before you start any takeoff. You know, is this thing even reasonable? And then find out what is the risk if that schedule is not met. You know, sometimes there isn't any risk. That's extremely limited these days, let's be honest. Most of the time there's liquidated damages. Okay, you know, now I understand kind of where things are going on this. And then I like to actually start to map that schedule out before, like even just in Excel, like draw out a quick Gantt chart of, okay, what are the big items on this project? You know, when is concrete going to be done? When is framing going to be done? Roughly when is the building going to be closed in? Where's my part in this? And where does my critical path start and end? And so once you have that, and that all takes a day or two to pull together, even on a larger project at a very high level. It's a quick way to understand where you're going to hit problems on the project.
Can I just interrupt you and just ask something real quick? Tell me if I'm off base here. It sounds like what I need to be able to do then is invest some time with some of my more experienced people up front, as opposed to just saying, oh, here's a bid, let me get it to my PE to start doing a takeoff. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that is effectively what I'm saying, 100%. You do have to put some fences around it, because, I mean, if you let, for example, a project manager drive the tender, you are going to struggle to win a job, because project managers, by the nature of their experience, see all the negatives. And they're always going to be like, oh, you forgot this on the last one, put it in. But they tend not to remember the duplicates. If you let just the estimator run the job, well, they're potentially just going to miss things and not necessarily understand the field risks. So it needs to be a combined team effort. And that can sometimes be very difficult to actually engender, because there's always that tension between the estimators and the execution team. But if you can overcome that, absolutely, you want to bring your superintendent in, you want to bring your foreman in, you want to bring your PM in and discuss the schedule. That's always one where you want them to be heavily invested in it. And that can, I would recommend that start to happen kind of a third to halfway point in the bid process, because you'll have something to show them. You'll be able to say, okay, this is the key volumes of concrete we have to lay. Where does this make sense? Do we need temporary heat? Those sort of things. And that's really where like your site super and your PM are going to be able to step in and say, oh, wow, we've never been able to pour that much concrete in a single run. We've got to put some brakes in here. And then you can start to ask the questions of the engineer, that sort of thing.
So let me ask you about that real quick. I want to explore that tension between the PMs and the estimators. There's this idea of, let's win the work, and after we've won the work, we'll figure it out.
Yep, that's one of the models. Absolutely.
And what I mean by that is I'm looking at my estimator and I'm saying, estimator, your job is to win the project. Project manager, your job is to value engineer it so we can make some money.
So there's a couple of different models. There's I'd like to say like kind of 3 overall models that companies tend to run. There is one where they want to keep those two parties hyper isolated. And I've seen some companies go so far as to actually put the estimators in a separate building. And they literally say you can only communicate via email. And I'm like, do you have a potato cannon that you just load all the estimate documents in and just launch it over to the other building and call it good? Write a number on it and say, here you go. And that's one of the ways they do it. Another one is a hyper-focused team effort where they're like, okay, for a project, they actually put the PM that they plan to assign on the project as part of the estimating team. That's become quite a bit more popular in the general contractor realm, is that methodology. And then you've got the third one where the estimator is the PM. That tends to be much more common in the mid-size. I've run some analytics, and that tends to work until the project reaches about a $3 million stage. And then it's just too large for a PM estimator to do solo. Does that kind of answer your question?
It does,
there?
But let's talk about it a little bit more. I'd like to think about it in terms of I'm the president of my company, or I have responsibility to some extent for both estimating and project management. What is my job? How do I negotiate that tension? Or even in this way, right? Let's say I'm the head of estimating, and then my counterpart is the head of project management. How do I negotiate that tension between the two of us so that it's doesn't cascade down throughout the rest of the organization and impact relationships negatively?
And the key there is if you do it wrong, it can become debilitating. Man, that is an excellent question. I think it actually has to be driven from above those two positions. Like the president of the company needs to take those two division managers out, sit them down and say, okay, if there's tension here, we need to go into a boxing ring and figure it out. If there is, any miscommunications, the president of the company needs to start to drive that collaboration, because if it's not driven from above them, it's extremely hard to overcome that internally. Now, I've seen it go both ways. I've seen companies where those two functions were at each other's throats, and there was pure animosity between execution and estimation. And I would swear that the vice president there actually encouraged that. And it became severely debilitating. Because let's be honest, if an estimator wants to get revenge on a PM, they can do it. And they can do it before anybody realizes. And I've seen the other side where the PM, where the head of estimating and the head of operations were really close friends and were able to collaborate with a layer of trust that was incredibly powerful. And it allowed us to do things that I haven't seen in other companies get accomplished.
Hey, this is Eric. This is the point in the show when I usually tell you to go out and buy my book, Construction Genius. And I'm going to do that. But then I'm also going to say this. In this podcast episode, Melvin and I are talking about some of the challenges associated with the silos that exist in construction companies, particularly between estimating and project management, and even between project management and folks out in the field. And if you're seeing those silos in your company, and you're thinking, man, I need to overcome them because if I don't, it's going to have an impact on the profitability of my business, reach out to me and let's have a discussion about how executive coaching for the people in your organization can help with some of those communication and relationship issues that you may have in your business right now. All day, every day, I'm working with my clients from the president level in a company all the way down through their senior project managers, helping them specifically to function more effectively as leaders. And my executive coaching is specifically for construction company owners. So reach out to me on my website, constructiongenius.com/contact. If you're the owner of your construction company or the president, let's talk about yourself, people in your organization, and we'll figure out very quickly if or how I can help you with executive coaching. Sometimes it's that outside voice, that sounding board that your leaders need to be able to articulate their issues and come to some resolution on how to overcome them, and then have someone hold them accountable for their action items. And that is exactly what I do with my executive coaching. All right, so let's get back to the conversation with Melvin. It's interesting, I think, going back to the responsibility of, let's say, the president of the company. One of the key mentoring pieces that you have to work on with your executive team is helping them to take off their hat for their particular silo and put on the company hat, and be able to understand the logic of the decisions that sometimes are made, which in the short term or on a project basis may, so to speak, go against one side of the company over another, but understand that there's a bigger picture in play here. And if at the executive level we can agree to the bigger picture, even if we may not necessarily, or let me put it this way, if we can commit to the bigger picture, even if we don't necessarily agree with all of the details, then that level of commitment can then be communicated throughout our organization in the different silos.
It's a lot of esprit de corps. Like, there's a lot of. Have you read The Art of War?
I've read it at some point. Yeah, not recently though.
Yes.
But go ahead.
I am a firm believer that everyone in business should have that as mandatory reading, because at the end of the day, your company functions very similar to a military unit. Some companies are able to engender an esprit de corps, a spirit in their company where it is unified. The company is heading in one direction. They know what they're doing. They know what their position is. The key is, if one of their counterparts stumble, they know not to shoot them in the back, but rather to try to pick them up. And that's a core problem that tends to happen between estimating and execution. In that tension is, an estimate is exactly that. It's an estimate. There is insufficient time to build the project in the estimating stage. Like, you have 6 weeks to put together a price for a job that's going to take place over 5 years. So if the estimators start to, if they make a mistake in there, it's key that the PMs come in and approach that in a collaborative way and dispense with emotion. And that is the hardest thing. And that, again, circling right back to the beginning, at the schedule stage, that is such a key point, is dispense with the emotion on both sides of the fence, bring the groups together for execution and estimation, agree on that schedule. And yes, it's going to change when the project moves forward. You are going to have a tsunami of hurricanes roll across your project in the year. It's going to be terrible weather. You're going to get half the productivity you anticipated. But that's not necessarily anyone's fault. You can go back and say, okay, this is what was discussed at the estimating stage. How do we couch this next time? Can it be couched? Or is this, act of God kind of contractual stuff? And work together on it. One of my favorites was when I was young in my career as an estimator. I screwed up an estimate really badly. I misread a quote and dropped 30% roughly out of the what should have been carried for equipment on a project. And what made it even worse was I was told by management to submit this bid, but they didn't actually want the job. And boy, did I win it for them. And so the ops manager, when he took it on, and they were going through everything, and he came back to me and he's like, "You screwed this up." And I'm like, "No, I didn't. I'm no, you can't see your own mistakes." And so he sat me down and walked me through it, and I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I've screwed this up badly." He's like, "Yep." He's like, "Okay, your punishment is you have to go negotiate the buyout now of this. You get to go back to the to buy this stuff, and you have to tell them you have $0 to do it." So I got to go and negotiate for buying out all this equipment with a supplier who, to their credit, treated us fantastically. Like, I took the guy out to lunch and I'm like, "Hey man, I'm here to buy your stuff." And he was all excited. I'm like, "But I got to negotiate the price." He's like, "Oh, how much of a discount do you need?" I'm like, 100%. And he just looks at me and he's like, "Oh, that's hilarious." I'm like, "No, man, it's 100%. I screwed this up. So we got to do something here." And he worked with us. It was fantastic. And the ops manager came back and said, "Okay, you've actually achieved more than I thought you would here. You've done well. We'll take it from here." And he managed to turn that project in from a negative 20% margin to a plus 5% margin at the end of it. And at that point, I'm like, man, when we work as a team, it is an incredibly powerful situation.
So let me make a note here. It's a very excellent way of mentoring and training people is if they do make a mistake, allow them to bear some of the natural consequences of the mistake, and actually, like your boss did, have you go out and negotiate the buyout, and that can help to
Yep.
lock in the learning. Because I think sometimes what happens is that we just want to fix stuff, and we miss the mentoring and the developing opportunity. And I know we're on a podcast here, so you might be thinking, yeah, Eric, easy for you to say, but I got thousands, tens of thousands of dollars or millions even on the line here. But at some point, you've got to ask yourself, how are my folks going to get on the job training? How are they going to get those kinds of opportunities to learn from their mistakes so they don't repeat them again and again?
And this kind of goes back to the three models there. Like, you can't let your estimators be invincible. Like, that's a key thing. Like, you're hitting the nail on the head there, Eric. When somebody screws up, don't hang them for it. Give them the some of those natural consequences. If we're talking hundreds of millions, or some massive risk item that may be on the table here, you're going to want to be involved in that too. But it is always best to bring the estimators in, and the people who have made this mistake, bring them into the resolution so they understand the next time they see it. And I can tell you 100%, I have never missed those items on an estimate ever again. And it was that learning experience early on where it was the tough learning.
That's excellent. So let's go back, and we've been talking a lot about schedule, but we've been talking about risk as well. As you're working with your clients, as you're drawing on your experience in the construction industry, what are some other elements of risk that are often neglected or come around and pounce on people and cause a lot of grief?
Location, location, location. This is always a huge risk. When you get the drawing package in, they'll show you all the pretty renderings of the building. They'll show you, all these things. What they don't show you is that it's right downtown and you have no access. And the elevators are obviously not running because they're not installed yet. And they could only fit one crane on this building, and the hours that it's available to your work are between 2 and 3 a.m. So, like, it's location, location, location. Understanding where your project is happening. I had a fun project that I was involved with. It was called the Canadian High Arctic Research Facility, the CHARS facility station, Canadian High Arctic Research Station, CHARS for short. And it's on an island way up inside the North Arctic Circle. And we had to build the building there. And you had a 2-week window where the icebreaker could get through the ice and they could carry your sea cans on a barge basically behind the icebreaker, and you had to bring your entire year's supply of material within a 2-week window. And what was even more hilarious was they obviously didn't have a dock or anything to pull up on, so they dragged your sea can onto the beach, and then it was about a mile to the actual site. And yep, that's
Is
it.
that the building? Yeah. If you're watching on
That's it.
YouTube, you can see a shot of the Canadian High Arctic Research Station.
Exactly. And we had to work out the logistics for this thing. And that became the number one risk factor on the project, was how do we get logistics to get everything there. And like it's a beautiful building that's like in the middle of absolute nowhere.
Yeah, there it is.
And so, yep. And so they would drop it on the beach, and then there was one person in town that had a Caterpillar D6 or D9. I can't remember what it was. And he would drag your sea can from the beach to site. What we were charged for that last mile was double all the other expenses to get to the beach. But it was just what you had to figure out in the bid. And all of this had to go in. I think we had 8 weeks to put the estimate together for this one. It was a wild bid to figure out exactly what you're saying, the risk analysis. And in the winter, if you're working on this, it's 24 hours a day darkness. In the summer, your productivity goes up because it's 24 hours a day of sunlight, but you have to be very careful you don't destroy the people working on your projects.
Yeah, interesting, huh?
Yeah, like we had to get into psychology, we had to get into everything for a construction project. So location, location, location.
That's great. That's awesome. Awesome. So in terms of location, obviously I have to think about weather. I have to think about the supply of labor. I have to think about the supply of materials. I even have to think about the project partners that I'm working with and how the way they run their ship or their shop, so to speak, is going to impact me. What are some other risks that are on the table that sometimes get missed that are really tremendously challenging for contractors?
What it takes to get to a work phase. So we all have every trade has their organization that kind of gives you the standards. Like in electrical, there's the North American Contractors Association, NECA, and then there's the Mechanical Contractors Association, MCA. There's a number of different ones for excavating, concrete, framing, and they'll give you kind of book values for certain work functions. But you have to understand and read the front end of those documents very, very carefully because they make a certain number of assumptions. And the thing that tends to be very often forgotten is if you're doing a high rise building, once you get over the 10th floor, productivity starts to drop dramatically. And it's simply because you can't get people there in a reasonable amount of time. And so you have to start to think like once you get over 10 stories, it gets really ugly. Once you get over 60 stories, you have to be like totally thinking about everything different because your people will never be coming back down to the ground for lunch. They will never be coming back down to the ground to go to the washroom. You just simply can't because the only thing you have in this building is stairs, and that's it, and some man lifts. So that getting to the work face, the analysis on that is absolutely critical, and is often missed. Another key one on excavation is what are you doing with the dirt? Like, where are you putting what you're moving? And that one's not missed so much. It just tends to be underappreciated in a lot of instances. And what it takes for your circuit time for your vehicles to make it through. Um, those are kind of, concrete guys tend to have it, I found, best dialed in. They know, again, once you start to get over those stories, kind of how it's going. Um, building dams, again, it goes back to location and then time of year, which is your schedule. Schedule is everything. And how do you do the concrete on a dam? Because they're always built in remote areas. The vast majority, Kiewit has a wicked process. They basically just move in mini batch plants, and then they'll build rails out to it, and they just make concrete 24 hours a day and build up your dam. Um, it's I've had the privilege of working on a couple of projects with them on some big dams
What did
in
you? So yes, let's talk about that real quick. That's interesting. What did you learn from working with Kiewit? What do they do that sets them apart and helps them to be able to execute these incredibly complex, difficult projects?
massive expertise. They employ people that I wish we could all learn from in it, as like superintendents, as project managers. As a counterpoint to that, unfortunately, they also like to try to overload their projects with lawyers, and we've had to work through some of that in there. Um, but when it comes to like boots in the field, Kiewit has some really, really top notch A teams. And understanding that's another massive risk that gets overlooked is, okay, or not necessarily overlooked, but misquantified often, is, when you're at the estimating stage, very often you always like to put the A team on the project. But if the A team isn't available at execution time, that's a fundamental change that may be extremely difficult to overcome.
That's a good one right there. That we should take note of. Right. I estimate perhaps and even if I appreciate the things that you were talking about in terms of location, I may estimate it for my A team and then get my B team on the project, and that can be tremendously challenging.
Exactly. And there's a major contracting company that I worked for here at Acon. They have a roads team that specializes in highways, bridges, all that kind of infrastructure, heavy civil. They had a process tuned out that I've never seen anywhere else, where they would actually bid every job with the A, B, and C team, and they would see what happened on the job before they closed. They used a software platform called Hard Dollar, which was actually developed by Kiewit, um, and has since been spun out into a wholly owned subsidiary. But you could put all of your crews in there, and then you could very rapidly swap them in and out of these estimates, so you could understand what your risk was. And that all went into a risk analysis that they would do on every single project. The level of detail of it changed depending on the value of the project. For a $30,000 project, that risk analysis was a one line, zero. On a $300 million project, that was a highly detailed risk register. And what happened between your A and your C teams was all in there. And then there was probabilities assigned to that on what was the likelihood of A team being pre-booked and moving to the B team. And then that was carried as a risk contingency on the project.
Excellent. So we've identified many areas of risk. We kicked off by starting a discussion in terms of the schedule. Reflecting on the whole conversation here today, Melvin, give the listeners 2 or 3 takeaways for them to be focusing on in order to avoid some of these mistakes and maximize their opportunity to build profitably.
Okay, number one, always demand the front end documents. If you're a sub trade and the GC is not sharing those with you, straight up walk away from the job, because there's something totally wrong there. Always demand those first 100 pages or so of the document. Number two, read those pages. Before you close that job, get very intimate with understanding those front end documents, because that's where, like I said, 75+% of your risk is going to be in those first 100 pages. So once you have that identified, number 3 is produce a risk register for every project where you itemize what you see on here, the schedule. Okay, can I hit this? What happens if I overrun it? What happens to liquidated damages? What happens to my contractual obligations? What's the chances of material not being available? Itemize all of those. And, on a large project, a risk register might run 50 to 100 lines. Like we're talking on, hundreds of millions of dollar size project. On your smaller $10 to $20 million projects, you're going to be in the maybe 5 to 20 lines of risk on this. Get as detailed as you reasonably can with your risk, and then take that risk register to your operations team. Put it on the table, say, here's what I've identified. If I'm the estimator, here's what I've identified. Let's check them off. Can we zero these out somehow? Because you never want to blow your project bid out of the water by carrying a huge contingency. So if you sit down with your ops team and go through with your superintendent and your PM, they've run into lots of these risks in real life before. So sit down with them and say, okay, can you mitigate this? How do you mitigate this? Can we mitigate this without putting money in? And then once you get through that discussion, you will have a very solid game plan for how to execute. And what's really nice is if you can do that with the PM that is going to actually run that project, you can all agree to what's going to happen here and put together a comprehensive team package that's submitted. Like I've seen this model work very effectively with a number of the GCs that I've worked with, where they've managed to break down a lot of the combative barriers between estimating and execution. And when you bring those people together and they work as a unified team, it's incredibly competitive, incredibly powerful way of mitigating the risk while still understanding where the risk can't be mitigated and needs to be mitigated financially.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Melvin, tell us a little bit more about yourself and your company, please.
So 15 years full-time estimator, and then a couple of years now full-time entrepreneur and business owner with PataBid. We produce estimating software, AI-driven estimating software. We aggregate public procurement to track the very tip of the business spear, and then we move into detailed estimation, largely focused on the complex trades. And we use heavily based on AI to, like I said, accelerate the grunt work, not to replace the estimator, and bring a lot of these risk items analysis to the front so that our contractors can bid work in the incredibly constrained timeframes they have right now without a loss in accuracy and mitigate the risks. That really is a nutshell. I mean, we are driven to change the way the front end of construction business operates these days. And I mean, if you ever want to go down a deep hole into that one, I can stand up on my soapbox and really start to preach about where we got to get the industry to in the front end of business.
That's great. We'll have to have you back on to go through that. What I'd like you to do, though, is tell the audience, because I know we have a diverse group of people listening here, who is your ideal client, the one person who must visit patabid.com and learn more about what it is that you guys do?
Mechanical, electrical, plumbing trades in the, 50 plus range, employee sized business, that mid-size company. And in those complex trades, those are the must come see. And if you're involved in fire protection or any of those kind of subs of subs.
Excellent.
We're heavily geared to that.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to have links in the show notes so that you can check out PataBid. Melvin, I really appreciate you coming on, sharing your real world experience, and I do wish you all the best.
In the cold white north. Thank you.
Right on. Thank you for listening to my discussion today with Melvin. Hope you enjoyed our talk. I know that I did. And feel free to reach out to him on his website, patabid.com, particularly if you fall in that target market that he articulated very clearly at the end of the podcast. Feel free to share this episode with other people who you think would benefit from listening to the insights about schedule and risk. And please give the podcast a rating and a review wherever you get your podcasts. And the reason I ask you to do that, as a result of that, what happens is people can see the podcast on the interwebs. And then one final request I have for you. Go to my YouTube channel, just search Construction Genius and subscribe. My YouTube game needs a big upgrade. And the more subscribers we get, the more my game will upgrade. That's a key part of it. So help me out there if you will. And I appreciate you listening to Construction Genius here today.